entire idea of the economy and the constitutional values that Israel had, and that we, most of us as Americans today, have inherited and enjoy today. Yes, Betty, thank you so much. I will relate that to my son. If some of you do not know, my son Luke did earn his Eagle Scout, and we had his ceremony last week, and it was wonderful. He did a speech, as Eagle Scouts do when they accept their confirmation, and he really did a fabulous job. I was very impressed with his ability to inject humor into his acceptance speech and to just include everyone. So it was a lot of fun. And thank you again, Betty. So this week, I want to start off with the role that genealogy as well as land ownership played in ancient Israel's constitution and in her society. As Westerners, you know, we've really grown accustomed, and we've grown almost resentful to anything that has any ties whatsoever to genealogy. Monarchy, we don't like this idea of, say, even in Britain, where, believe it or not, the monarchy is not just real popular, and you have a lot of these movements that go away from an inherited rulership or an inherited authority. Many of us, we don't even know who our great-grandparents are, and we certainly don't know who our great-great-grandparents are. They have no bearing on our lives. We don't know who we are, where we came from, or anything of that nature. This is very far removed from Israel's society, where your lineage, your heritage was so much a part of you. And if it were a good lineage, you inherited that. But here's the interesting thing with Israel's society. If you inherited a family reputation that was of poor repute, something that was not as honorable, say, as a kinsman down the road, you had the ability to change that and to change it in any generation at any time, because Israel's constitution allowed so much social mobility, things that you did not have in Egypt or India or a lot of other nations, where your trades, your professions were set before your birth. Everything was really preordained as far as who you would be, your social income, and all of that. You did not have that in Israel. So, and because their economy was based on capitalism, it allowed for a lot of mobility. So great you're here, Sylvia. Glad you could make it. So the first thing that you find with genealogies is that the land is based on tribal patriarchs. So when the land is distributed, Israel comes into Canaan after the Exodus. You find that the land, the divisions of land, what we may call states today very loosely, were called after their forefathers. So you had Issachar, Judah, Zebulon. All of these were inherited pieces of land, and Zebulon's children lived on Zebulon's land. You had Issachar's children who lived on Issachar's land, and same thing with Dan. So you had a lot of familiarity. You had a lot of unity within that particular tribal state, because it was all in the family. But there were a lot of different things, issues that came up. And I love this section because we see the issue of women's rights being asserted. Unlike, say, Persia or Babylon, or later, say, Sharia type law codes, we do not see women maligned in ancient Israel's law code. In this particular instance, and this is going to be in Numbers 27, we have the daughters of Zeophold who come to Moshe, and they say, our father has died and he did not have any sons. Why should his name be put out of Israel? Now, the interesting thing that this reveals by tying his name to the land is that a person's name, a family name, like for instance, mine is Onstott. So my husband's family, their name would be tied to this land throughout their generations. And as a new clan developed, new sons were born, you would carry that name with you. Now, there might be some instances where a woman was a determinant, but even then, as we will see, the lineage still fell under either the father or the husband's household, depending on which side she had inherited her land. If you hear some ruckus in the background, we have a neighborhood, an entire legion of kids outside playing, not hide and go seek, mind you, because that's passe. That's what grandma, mom and dad played when they were young. I believe the correct term is now wolves in the graveyard, or some sort of Avenger type hide and go seek game that they play. The rules are actually even slightly different. So anyways, if you hear a mob hysteria in the background, that's what you're hearing. So coming back to Zelophehad's daughters, we find the idea that a man's name is tied to his land, his heritage. And what's interesting, when you follow the discussion through Numbers 27 and then again in Numbers 36, you find that when the Jubilee occurred, we think of the Jubilee as a time where indebted slaves, indebted servants were set free. But that was really just part of it, because the other part was an administrative function. The Levites served as your bureaucratic administrators, and not so much bureaucratic as really more essential administrators. They recorded land transactions. If there was a death and that man had no heirs, the Levites had to record at the end of that 50-year period who inherited his property. And that inheritance of the property was still tied to national citizenship. So last week we looked at Israel's tribal heritage, where you had Israelite citizens, native Israelite citizens, who would have been the children of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and one of the tribes. These children had to prove their lineage based on their tribal land ownership. And it was that tribal land ownership that gave them the ability to vote in Israel's legislative assemblies. America, when the nation was first founded, followed a very similar rule of law, where at the writing of the American Constitution, the only people that were allowed to vote were landholding citizens. I believe it was after the Civil War where this law was changed. I did not have time to put that into my notes, but I may come back to it next week and elaborate a little bit more on it, because it's fascinating when you see how it changes politics, how it changes your future, how it changes who has the right to rule over you. And let me give you a good demonstration of this. Israel's tribal ownership, again, was tied to the rural lands. This would not have been land ownership within cities. It would not have been land ownership of large apartment buildings. It would have been your land ownership of the heartland, the farmland that sustained the society. And when you look at America, the people that have the most traditional family values, that really understand what's at stake for the future of America politically, are, again, your heartland. It is your farmers, it is your people who are involved in agriculture, that are tied to the family, that are really able to see long-term consequences and are not just playing a political game or working to earn political favors. So you see a lot of wisdom in tying land ownership to not only genealogy, but then tying that genealogy to rural land ownership. So we find in this story of Zeopold the idea that a woman can own, on her own accord, without any man, can own tribal lands. This would have given her, as we will see next week, would have given her the right to vote in Israel's legislative assemblies. Beyond this, when she bears a son, that son inherits her estate. Now, if she bears no children, no sons, a daughter would inherit her estate. But it is assumed that within 1 or 2 generations, a son would inherit that estate. At the point in time that a son is acquired or a son is born, the women no longer play any role in the genealogical record. Now, I know that this contradicts what some religions teach and what is currently popular among certain religions, but this is what the Torah states. This is straight from the text. And when you follow the story of Leopold and you reconstruct it, it really allows no other reconstruction. You know, an argument has been made that the temporary ability, the fact that the woman is not a permanent lineage liaison, that was only, say, within the priesthood that she was temporary, or that her ability to transfer the land from a child was only within the priesthood. You know, that flies in the face because Leopold's daughters were from the tribe of Manasseh. So we find this story of land ownership within the context of one of the 12 tribes, where this would have been relevant to all the tribes except the tribe of Levi, ironically, where men within the tribe of Levi own no arable lands, which meant that, guess what? Levi's children could not vote or participate in the legislative assemblies. So Levi, who bore the house of government, they were government administrators, they were teachers, they served loosely as some type of physician, diagnosing illnesses. These type of, if you were held a government post, you did not have the right to vote in certain legislative assemblies because you were a government worker and you did not own those arable lands that gained you access to your voting privileges. So again, in the 50th year, you find that the land heritages were realigned. So if someone had died and it had passed to another family, in the 50th year, the Levites would make a new record and a new title of land ownership as those, to keep the records pure and the land ownership and a clean title, basically, something that we do here in America. And we find that anciently, when you research Assyrian archives, Elba archives, Egyptian archives, you really have a lot of land transactions recorded in every institution where they recorded land transfers and title. The other thing that you find is that when a ger came into the land, this would have been a convert, someone who came into Israel's borders and wanted citizenship. Now, we discussed 2 weeks ago that when you came in and you sought citizenship, that there was also this compulsion to love Israel's God, to follow Israel's law, and you were to be as one of the native Ezrach. There was no difference. But you find that even though you became one of the citizens of Israel, you gained all rights, all privileges, and there was no distinction, you still did not get a portion of land. That land had already been divided. The entire land of Israel was owned by one family or another, so there simply was no other land to hand out. It wasn't as though the government owned these large refuge centers, or the government had annexed large portions of land for for sanctuaries, whether it would be wildlife or nature or national parks. You just simply didn't have that. Israel's limited economy meant that every piece of land, there was a great deal of demand on it because of the limited availability. So that land, again, owned to families. So the only way that a ger could really become a full-fledged citizen, and let me specify that this only deals with men, because women were in an entirely different situation, which we'll look at in a minute. But for a man to fully integrate into Israel, he would have to marry a woman within Israel. And this man would have to be loved by her father so much, by the woman's father so much, that he would be willing to offer him a portion of land out of his heritage, and for her family and the son-in-law's family to grow up and to have their own little clan. Now, the interesting thing that we find is that in these instances, the ger was reckoned according to her father's house. He really didn't have his own name. We find a few, like Brizreli in Jeremiah. We find a few limited instances where a ger did make his own name, but that was not necessarily the custom that occurred. So I have often heard, especially among a lot of skeptic circles, that King David was ineligible for the priesthood because his mother was a Moabite. Now, if you're familiar with Deuteronomy, I believe it's Deuteronomy 23. Let me check my notes here. 23 verse 3 states that a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of Israel for 10 generations. And we are going to look at this particular injunction in greater detail next week. But I just want to address the lineage of David because it has become kind of a hot topic that you may have seen debated in recent years. David would have been the third generation from his Moabite grandmother. So would this ban have applied to him? And scripture definitely supports that ban was not applicable to David in any way, and this is why. When we talk about citizenship, when we talk about lineage, it is always male determinative. That means that women didn't determine anything. When they became an heiress of a arable land, she was only an heiress until she either married another man, at which time at the 50th Jubilee, that land would be realigned with her husband's estate. Or if she never married, that land upon her death, that land would be realigned with her father or her father's kinsmen and their estates. So a woman was always temporary. And then what citizenship status she did have was always viewed in the context of either her husband, father, or brother. Usually more so the father and the husband. So what happens when you have a woman like Ruth who immigrates to Israel, who inherits her husband's land and seeks citizenship? Well, we find that the woman is given or granted, recognized to have whatever citizenship her husband had, whether it's her late husband or a current husband. So if Ruth's husband has citizenship, then so does Ruth. And really the fact that she's a Moabite is totally erased by the fact that she has joined Israel and she has become, joined into that tribe. The same does not hold true for men. Men had a greater military power. Men had, different social standing that allowed them to pose a greater threat to Israel's society. Perhaps a great analogy today is we see this in Europe. It isn't the Syrian women that you find posing a threat throughout Europe. It is these mass migrations of Syrian men that carry with them ideas that are alien and actually are very abusive of Western democratic societies. You find that these men are the ones that pose the greatest threat. Times don't change. The same would have held true in ancient Israel's days. You find that God limited that threat, and he secured protected Israel's national security by controlling the ways by which people could integrate into Israel's society. So a woman such as Ruth is allowed to have this land. Ruth could have kept Chilion's land until her death, or she could marry, which she did. When she married Boaz, she the land transferred from her husband's family to Boaz and his family. And then the children are then reckoned according to that family. So you find that in no way does Ruth's heritage as a Moabite censor David in any way, because again, she is not viewed to have the same citizenship status as what a man would have. Let's see. And then let me point out this, because I think it's very important, because we get a very, I think, touchy regarding Israel and racial issues, lineage issues, and I don't want to say politically correct, but that it does tend to fall into the category when we discuss these things of how we try to avoid certain topics. And I want to point out that the prohibition on, and the difference in citizenship categories, and like a prohibition on Moabites, really had nothing to do with race. It was not that God or the Mosaic Code had a hatred to Moabites, but rather it was the fact that the Moabites had a hatred and had a very hostile policy towards Israel, which was a national security threat to them. So God's ban on Moabites coming into his congregation. Now, again, the congregation was a legislative voting body from which the Moabites were banned. This ban, again, was not racial, it was political, and it was religious, because God did not want to open up his society to allow subversive forces to come in and corrupt Israel's doctrine, corrupt her liberty, or take her down a path that would have not just curtailed her liberty, but brought her back into bondage and lost the sure foundation that she had been granted. You know, today, even in America, there had been several bans on Sharia in the last year or two, especially the last year, as the Muslim population continues to increase in America, where the bans in Sharia are not bans against a race. They're not really even a bans against a religion per se, but they are bans against a political system that competes and opposes Western democratic values founded on constitutional liberties. I don't know if you guys saw the interview that I did last Monday, but I did delve a little bit into Sharia and explored some of the ways in which Sharia opposes basic human rights, and the ways in which the law has different conflicting laws and really delivers any society, whether it's in the Middle East or here in America, into oppression. We find the exact opposite in Israel's society, where the constitutional code established a precedent of liberty, of universality, one law for all citizens, human rights universally applied for all citizens. The other thing that we find, one of the very first things that God does when he brings Abraham out of Ur, is he promised to make Abraham a blessing to all nations. And you find this especially in the burnt offering covenant, where he is commanded to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, and then he is given this enormous blessing that is to be transferred to his descendants. And we've discussed this again, but I think it's important to go over it in this lesson, simply because it is the foundation of Israel's constitution. So it's so important that we're grounded in it. You find that a birthright specifically means a double inheritance of land. We find Israel gained this double inheritance of land when the 12 tribes inherited the land of Israel from the river Euphrates to the Moasic branch of the Nile there in the Sinai. But they were granted a double portion, a second portion, on the other side of the Jordan River in what is today modern Jordan. And we find that this comprised the ancient land of Israel, and their double blessing or their double portion. Now, while the birthright specifically distinguished their land inheritance, the blessing defined their government or their leadership. In fact, this was the point of contention between Jacob and Esau. When Jacob usurped Esau's blessing, Jacob was usurping the right to rule over Abraham's children. And we can see that this usurpation has had consequences. There's been a lot of conflict, a lot of jealousy between Jacob and Esau and their descendants for thousands of years. You find, early in Islamic history, you find Muhammad going in and slaughtering entire villages of Jews due to this hatred and this rivalry that exists, mainly because of the way in which Jacob obtained this blessing and this right to leadership. But over and over again, what we find throughout Genesis and throughout all the words of God to the patriarchs is this idea that this blessing, this something that's actually very tangible that's given to Abraham, is something that will one day in the end become a blessing to the entire world. Now, I'm going to step back just a minute, because the common belief and the common interpretation of Genesis 12 and of the patriarchal covenants is that this blessing referred simply to the promise of a coming Savior. Now, there were other blessings that Abraham was given. I mean, this blessing, the idea that he will be a blessing to the entire world, was only one of the blessings. Another blessing that Abraham is given, he is promised that Ishmael will become exceedingly fruitful and that he will have 12 princesses, or princes, not princesses. This is a promise that is hereditary. It is national, that Ishmael would be a blessing and that he would become this great nation is something that exists with outside any of the ideas of messianism. So we find that very likely this idea of blessing probably does not have a messianic message or a messianic content in the way we have been traditionally, I would say, schooled or taught. And I do encourage you to research that for yourself. But again, how is a Messiah going to fulfill the blessing to Abraham of Ishmael having 12 tribes that become a great nation? So you also find that the foundation, the entire foundation of this Abrahamic blessing that is given to the nation of Israel, it's really inherited by them, is one that is political, and that politics is constitutional. So it is this constitutional idea that is inherited by Abraham and his children that becomes a blessing. So let's get into exactly what this blessing is. Why is this blessing so important? How does it become something that will benefit the entire world one day when, I guess, nations finally recognize it and finally acknowledge it? So one of the first things that we find is that Israel's constitution established a balance of power. Now, if you guys are following along with me, let me tell you what page I am on. We are on page 253 and page 254 in Yahweh Exists. That's where I am right now. So you find that Israel's society, Israel's economy, their entire government structure is founded first upon families on the land, tribal heritages. Their economy is land-based. Rather than redistributing wealth, God redistributes land and uses that to tie families together, to anchor them in very strong family relationships where they have to learn to get along with each other. And then after they get along with each other, they then are able to interact with their greater society and share that unity nationally and enjoy that brotherhood of patriotism. But after that, you find that there are other economic injunctions with their national holidays. The Jubilee relieves debt every 6 years. So not only does every male citizen have land ownership, his debt, if he should get into debt, is either relieved every 6 years or every 49 years. Those were the two limits, and it could not exceed beyond one of those limits. You also find that families always returned to their land. There was nothing you could do constitutionally within Israel's society to disenfranchise a family from their tribal heritage. A king could not come in, although they did when they ignored the Constitution and tried to write edicts that were against the Constitution. But according to the Constitution, the leader could not come in and take anyone's land. As a matter of fact, this was the issue at stake with Ahab and Jezebel when they came in and wanted to take Naboth's vineyard. They usurped their constitutional rights, and that is why God issues a curse against Ahab and his house, because that crime was considered so egregious and such an overstep of constitutionally delegated authority that an incredible curse is issued against Ahab. And we're going to see the importance of this curse as we get into part 2 of Yahweh Exists a while from now, but it is a very important point. The other thing that we find with the idea of constitution is that Israel's government indeed established 3 branches of power to balance and offset each other. You had the high priest, who served as the supreme court within the land. When you also find that the Levites were to form a type of federal judge. You find references to tribal judges within the books of Numbers and Leviticus, but then you also find judges within the Levites. So the common reconstruction among biblical scholars who study ancient Israel's law code is that the Levites formed a type of federal court, and your tribes formed a type of lower court, where if disputes could not be solved in the lower courts, they would then be appealed to the federal or Levitical. So you have the high priest and the Levites forming judges on the land. You also have an executive branch in the monarchy. Now, this was not a unlimited power where the king could do anything that he wanted. Okay, see, I'm getting a note here. Let me respond. Okay, see the video. Okay, so I just got a message that I responded to, hoping everybody can still see. If we're having video trouble, just let me know, and I can look and see what's going on. I don't see any issues on my end, but please let me know if you see any on your end. So we find that the executive had a lot of constraints on it. We find that the executive was basically established as a constitutional monarchy. One of the things that the monarchy is banned from doing is multiplying horses. That's kind of an ancient term for armaments, having massive armament buildup, simply because those armaments would increase taxation of the people. In ancient times, maintaining a standing army was very expensive. It usually required families to quarter regiments. And as a matter of fact, in Gideon's days, we find that there was a lot of retribution and a lot of political backlash, because Gideon, who stood up to deliver a lot of the communities that were being affected by the Amalekites and Moabites and all of those roving tribes. He delivered them. And then you find that some of these people refused to quarter their regiments to give them food or supplies of any kind when, you know, Gideon had alleviated them from that. Hold on real quick. I just want to, okay. All right. So I'm not sure if everyone else is having trouble with the video, but everything does look fine on my end. So maybe just go in and refresh. And if you refresh, it may help. So you also find the other thing that God forbids a monarch from doing, or any person who has executive power, is from initiating a corvée within Israel's citizens. A corvée system would have been, and throughout Israel's prophets and throughout especially the Exodus era, you find this idea of returning to the house of bondage. Don't return to the house of bondage. Well, the corvée was the return to the house of bondage, because that was the system Israel was drafted into in the land of Egypt. It was a compulsory public service that you had to render to the state, whether you wanted to or not. If you were wealthy, you could pay a high tax to get out of it, but few people had the privilege of wealth to get out of that slavery type of system. So God forbid that of Israel's citizens, but as we see with King Solomon, he did indeed require that of many of the foreigners that lived in Israel's land, and he contracted or composed his corvée from their citizens. The other thing that the law forbids with the constitutional monarchy are large harems. Harems were very costly. Women, the supporting women, clothing them, whether they're jewels, gems, or other indulgences they could have, would be very costly for the nation to support. So God banned that. The other thing that God banned with the harem was this idea of indulgence, you know, an indulgence that would take the king and distract him from matters of state, where he would become, you know, involved and more focused on his own personal pleasures. So you find that, again, this grounds the king in very solid policy, keeping his feet on the straight and narrow. Scripture encourages the king to be a shepherd that leads the people rather than one that rules over them. And the one part of the constitutional monarchy, one of the provisions of it that I just love, is the idea that the king, upon his installment, had to write a copy of the law. You know, today when the president is installed in office, the only thing he has to do is put his hands on the Bible and say, you know, I do solemnly swear, you know, to take this office, all of this. How much more meaningful would it be if the first, say, 30 days that president is in office, he has to, before the members of Congress, you know, just sit up there, you know, in the before all of them, and he has to copy every single word of the U.S. Constitution, write it down. He could never say, I don't know. He can never say, I did not know that the Constitution supported the Second Amendment, or that citizens have the right to bear arms, or that citizens have the right to free speech. Do you know how many issues that could help resolve and the unity it could instill in a land by the leader writing that Constitution? And it was a pledge to uphold that Constitution. It could really, yes, agree, Cindy, great point. It should apply to anyone holding public office, because if you are going to represent the people and uphold a system of values and standards, you need to be solidly grounded in it, more than the average citizen who is not going to make decisions for the populace where those considerations should be taken into judgment. Now, the other thing that you find, which is very interesting, is that during the Judges era, and I've alluded to this before. I haven't written anything on it, but it's in a forthcoming book. During the Judges era, it's very interesting that the Shaphat, or the leaderships, not only had they would judge in disputes among Israel's citizens, but they also acted as a general within Israel's country. And you find that God terms this system as having more liberty than a monarchy, where, and you really find it's fascinating, because you find that Israel's leaders and Israel's citizens, no one really wants to rule over each other. Gideon's given the opportunity. He says, no, I don't want to rule over you. You know, rule over yourselves. Be self-sufficient. You find again with Japheth, this idea of wanting another leader, strong leader, to rule over the people. And they again refuse, saying, no, you take care of yourselves. The Constitution is sufficient. Rule over yourselves and follow it for yourself. But you find that this was something that never really resonated with Israel's citizens. But it reminded me of the righteous, perhaps, precedent that George Washington followed. And when he was asked to rule over, or rather to take the presidency of the United States, he refused. And everything that he did when he finally did accept the presidency, and when he was put into office, everything that he did, he saw as setting a precedent for all the other presidents that would succeed him. And he did. He set an incredible precedent whereby he limited his powers, he restricted them, and he held back at every juncture where he could. And that has really given us a lot of light for the past 200 years. You find that Israel's judges set that same type of precedence, where they really did not want to get heavily involved in the affairs of the nation. They wanted local communities to rule over themselves and to take care of their own, each man enjoying the freedom and the liberty within his land. So that is basically, I wanted to stop there today. Oh, let me mention one more thing actually before we stop. And this is the idea of God's Son. Throughout the ancient world, whether you look at Babylon, Egypt, it really doesn't matter. Every single nation, pagan or righteous, viewed the king as God's son. He was a divine son. He had a divine right to rule. As a matter of fact, he ruled in God's stead. God had bestowed upon him the power to issue statutes, write statutes in his name, simply because God had put the authority of the kingdom in his hands. So you find that this authority was actually given to David. And let me share with you a particular text. This is going to be on page 257. Otherwise, it is in, hold on, let me find this real quick. I had marked it earlier. Okay, this is going to be on page 255, or if you want to follow along in scripture, it's Psalms 2, verses 7 through 9. God says to David, he says, I will declare the decree. Yahweh has said to me, you are my son. This day I have begotten you. Ask me, and I shall give you the heathen for your inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. The idea that you have with this is that God will give David the heathen as an inheritance among the nations, and that God establishes David as his son with a divine right to rule on Israel's throne. So God is sanctioning. You find that even though God does this, he's already said that Israel has rejected him from ruling over them. And he's already said that this divine sonship, this whole entire concept that the world has embraced, he's already said, this is a lesser way. You have rejected me, that I should reign over you. Because he says that my ways that I gave to you at Sinai, the ways that I gave to you when you first came into Canaan, these are actually superior. They will grant better liberty But again, because Israel did not want to follow that path, he gave them this other path where they had a monarchy. And again, it was a constitutional monarchy, so it was as limited as it could possibly be with that executive authority. Now, you do find that throughout history, especially Judah and Israel's history, the monarchs had the ability to abuse it, just as they do under any type of government system, whether it be democratic or whether it be a monarchical or hierarchy, or it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how righteous that system is. If you do not follow it, it will cease to exist, and you will cease to have the liberties and the human rights that you have that are established by it. So you find that there is no distinction in authority in scripture or even in other nations between the king's authority and God's authority. They're really viewed as one of the same. The king is viewed as speaking for God. But it's fascinating with Israel and the way that Israel's scribes kept a record and kept track as to whether or not the king had executed that divine authority righteously, or whether the king had abused that authority and used it unrighteously. So the Levites developed this formula whereby they would say, the king so-and-so did that which was right in the eyes of YHWH. Or they would say King Ahab did that which was evil in the sight of Yahweh. And it's funny because almost every single king without fail, whether it is of Judah or is Israel, is introduced to us in this context, or his life is concluded in this context. You also find that they were recognized for how well they utilized their authority and how well they upheld those constitutional ideals. You know, when God gives you such an honor and an authority in the land, it is so important that that king then reciprocate and recognize the one who is granting that power. So the most righteous kings in Israel's history are recognized for having sanctified Jehovah. And it's a very interesting concept where throughout scripture you find this idea that if we sanctify God, he will sanctify us. You find the same thing with the king, where the king is deemed righteous if he sanctifies the creator and walks in his way, or he is he is maligned and his memory is tainted by what he did that did not sanctify God or his constitution. So you find that kings are said to have done that which was right in the sight of God, but beyond that, you also sometimes have this clause, but, you know, they did that which was right. However, they did not remove the shrines or the high places. So they were good up to this extent, but they still failed to carry it one step forward. Most kings are measured according to King David, who set this righteous standard. You find that the only king in Israel's history that fully achieves this righteous standard as much as David did was King Hezekiah. Those are really the two kings that stand out in Israel's history as having raised the bar, or perhaps not raising the bar, just simply met that bar and that standard of liberty, righteous, and justice on the land that that recognized universal rights and that followed the Torah Constitution. And by recognizing God in their administration and in their words and actions, it sanctified and it established that liberty and freedom for every citizen in Israel's congregation. So that is really why so many of these things are important. Josiah was very important, but you know, Josiah did rebel in his latter days. So he was not as righteous as Hezekiah was, but he did make incredible reforms. He was a very important and integral part of Israel's history. And he was a righteous king, but Hezekiah is kind of given a higher standard of righteousness as far as upholding the Torah Constitution and seeking to integrate Israel's citizens into observing all the holy days. I think it says that no one had really observed the holy days like they had until Hezekiah. Josiah, I believe, also observed that, but it's not given as much paper, as much lead, or as much ink as what Hezekiah is in the written text. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to comments. I'm going to open it up to questions. Next week, we are going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of Israel's society. And this is where we're going to get into the role of Israel's legislative assemblies. Most people think of a theocratic government as being top-down, very top-heavy, and the people having very little voice and very little rights within a theocratic government. And I would like to challenge that position and present evidence that contradicts those assumptions, because we find that Israel and her constituents had a very strong voice in Israel's government, and it provided an incredible amount of liberty. So let me give you the pages that we're going to read for next time. We are going to go all the way to page, I think I said we were going to go all the way to page 274. So any questions or comments? It's great having you guys here, and I enjoy it, and looking forward to seeing you guys tomorrow at Roots of Faith, for those of you that can join. Now, just to let you know, on January 16th, I will be teaching at Roots of Faith. Ross will be out of town. And I will be teaching on how to study Torah, just kind of giving everyone the tools. Most of you guys have been around for a while, so some of this, probably most of it may be old hat for you, but you may know someone who is new to Torah study or biblical study, or just wants to freshen up on some of the fundamentals of how does the book make sense? You know, how can we come back and all see eye to eye and fulfill some of those ancient promises that just are laying there awaiting us to claim them? So I hope it's going to be something that y'all will benefit from. So any questions about this section of the book, comments? Again, it's great having all your comments, and thanks for keeping me up with the video. I know 2 weeks ago we had quite a bit of trouble with the video. I did not see that when we started tonight, but I don't know if it's a lag issue or something else. So, all right. Oh, it's so great to see you, Billy. So glad you're here. So, all right. Well, if nobody has any comments or questions, I'll wait a little bit for the lag time, and then I'll go ahead and shut the room down. If you guys do have a chance, I'm going to go ahead and type this in here. I did write a blog for those of you that enjoy reading blogs on the Charlie Hebdo and what is the biblical view of free speech. So I'm just going to write this in here. I'm going to have to put spaces so it will go through. So, but if you're interested in the debate over free speech and what Torah states regarding free speech, I do share some ideas there, and hope you'll find it enjoyable. So Shabbat Shalom. Have a fantastic evening, and we'll see some of you tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith at 10:30. And otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Shabbat Shalom.